We turn today to the subject of the United Church and war, which may seem like an odd topic to devote an entire week to, because we don't often think of Canada as having a strong military history. It's part of our self perception that we're a more peaceful nation, but in fact, we do have a rich and varied history of war and the involvement of the United Church as part of the Canadian nation gets us wrapped up in the questions of warfare and our response to it. You may recall that the first few years of the United Church's life were anything but ideal. 5 years after that grand celebration of union, we have the outbreak of the Great Depression. And from the Great Depression, we roll into the Second World War. If you were wanting to design the opening chapters of the story of a denomination, you might not choose those events as being the first things that the new creation encountered. They aren't exactly happy times. But as John Webster Grant noted regarding the Depression, it did a tremendous amount to knit together the new United Church. In Webster Grant's opinion, it did more than a comparative period of peace and tranquility would have done. And in a certain sense, the story of the Second World War is similar. And although it predates the founding of the United Church of Canada, we need to start our conversation about the challenge of war with World War One, because World War One had a major impact on subsequent church life, and memories of that conflict shaped responses to the Second World War. Canada entered the First World War with the unrestrained support of the churches, particularly the Methodist Church. Churches were involved in recruitment, and many sermons were preached extolling military service as a form of patriotic and Christian duty. The language of crusade was widely invoked. War involved church women in knitting scarves and socks and hats for soldiers and gathering bales of clothes for civilians in war devastated areas, providing daycare for those women entering the workforces, and comforting one another in their shared concern for those who were overseas. Meanwhile, the fight for prohibition was still going on, concluding with the Dominion wide vote to be dry in 1919. The end of the war and the return of soldiers from overseas had another impact on Canadian society. Prior to the war, there had been widespread optimism about the future. Technological innovation, in particular, was seen as the way in which a bright, fair, and just future could be introduced for everyone. However, the war demonstrated how increased technological sophistication could be used to wholesale destruction and killing. The concept of machines enslaving human beings rather than liberating them was a powerful subtext throughout much of the 20th century in literature, drama, and movies. The churches, having taken on the First World War as a glorious crusade, were very much part of the negative backlash when the war turned out to be something quite different. The churches had expended considerable reputational capital in promoting the war, and they found themselves viewed with the same suspicion cast on many social institutions. They were blamed for a war which did little for common people while being much about empire. Further, soldiers who had grown used to the somewhat freer moral standards of the war years were often unwilling to accept the tighter strictures of church and society. And women, having lived independently of men and having discovered their capacities in industry and commerce, were unwilling to retreat to the more restricted roles society had allotted to them in the pre-war period, roles which the churches seemed to support. And so the war accelerated a number of convictions about the roles of men and women in society, which were seen to be in opposition to the teachings of the church, or at least calling those teachings into question. Pre-war prejudices held that women were totally unfit for some jobs. Those preconceptions had simply not survive the test of reality. And so the Canadian society that emerged from World War I was drastically changed from that which had entered the war. The optimism of the late 1800s leading into the 1900s had given way. There were storm clouds on the horizon. Several of the empires which had been fixtures of the global scene had collapsed. Communist revolution had totally altered the face of Russia, but in ways which were not yet clear. There were significant questions about how human institutions could make life better, and indeed about the whole presence and absence of the divine in human affairs. Can God be on our side and their side too? All of these provided challenges for churches to regain their place in society. The treatment of those who took an anti-war stance also raised considerable questions about the capacity of the church to handle moral and sincerely held dissent. In an earlier week, we saw the treatment of J.S. Woodsworth, whose opposition to the war came not from pacifism, but from his objection to the profiteering of arms manufacturers. Many who had spoken against him earlier now wondered if, in fact, he did not have right on his side. Methodists who were pacifist for any reason had been treated very, very badly by their church during the war, and that left a sour taste as well as a certain amount of guilty feelings after the war. In the post-war period, as well as being heavily involved in the effort to win the vote for women, which largely emerged from their contribution to the war effort, Canadian society had to come to terms with a very different view of women as citizens, in fact, if not yet in law. And this, of course, impacted the churches. In the post-war period, there was a strong anti-war movement that spread across much of society. The First World War had been conflict on a scale and with a barbarity that most had never imagined possible, and there was a strong, visceral opposition to any possibility that it might occur again. During the 1920s and the 1930s, the United Church embraced the principles of pacifism, stating through the General Council that it, quote, held war to be contrary to the mind of Christ. With Hitler's rise to power and increasing aggression in Europe, the Church backpedaled somewhat and acknowledged that there was in fact a degree to which war was a necessary and acceptable evil for the defense of the innocent. Unlike during World War I, however, there was neither an active endorsement of nor enthusiasm for battle, and churches were much more restrained in their support of recruiting. So it was that on Sunday, September the 3rd, 1939, United Church congregations across the nation gathered with a sense of foreboding, tense and heavy-hearted. Only hours earlier, Great Britain had declared war, and although Canada's official entry was still a week away, there was no doubt what would happen. The church had been peace-minded. There were numerous missions overseas, and so the church now had an international outlook, and clergy and more committed lay people had been watching Japanese expansion in China, the growing power of Mussolini in Italy and of Hitler in Central Europe with great anxiety. The church had spoken out against the arms race. They had urged support for the League of Nations. The church had advocated economic sanctions which no country would apply because they interfered with trade and commerce. The 1939 yearbook reporting for the year 1938 stated, quote, "The matter that weighs most heavily on our people is the discovery of a Christian way to peace," end of quote. It reported that a group of churches and non-church groups had been working to persuade the Canadian government to open its doors to refugees and others who were victims of political persecution. There was some success in this effort. 5,000 political refugees were admitted in 1939. Now the church found itself involved in a war that it feared had been coming, and so on that fateful Sunday, clergy tried to speak an encouraging and strengthening word, because even the most unimaginative listener had an idea of what lay ahead. A few weeks later, the moderator, Dr. J. W. Woodside, in a letter to ministers, outlined their role in anguished times. Quote, "Our first task is to reaffirm our faith in God, the God who is the God of the end and will thus keep alive a sense of indestructible spiritual virtue. In the second place, we must keep alive the vision of the underlying unity of all Christian people in the worldwide and indivisible church. Thus shall we deliver our minds from the malice that war brings, and prepare our minds for the day of healing when peace shall come. We must remember the paramount authority of conscience. We are at war with a power that seems to disregard conscience, and we must not fall into its error." End of quote. There were some clergy whose opposition to war in any form was absolute. 75 of them published, quote, "A Witness Against War" in the Observer, and though the General Council sub-executive repudiated it as unrepresentative of the Church as a whole, it kept its lines of communication open with the pacifist minority, and only a few had to break their congregational relationships, which was a far cry from the pattern in World War I. Meanwhile, acting for the great majority who felt that after the attack on Poland there was no option but to fight, the Church organized a War Services Committee. And it was this group that administered the Church's response to war by setting up war service units in pastoral charges to sew and knit for refugees and combatants. The material was provided to the Red Cross, and soon about 1,000 groups were at work, and by the end of June 1941, they had turned in 2.5 million articles. The Church also organized chaplains, and in a couple of years, in addition to those serving as combatants, 120 United Church clergy were serving with units at home and abroad, which seriously depleted an already understaffed church. By the end of the war, the number of chaplains reached 254. Every congregation in Canada and Newfoundland felt the impact. In no time, their young men and some of their young women were enlisted and far away. By the end of 1941, 500,000 were under arms, including 1,200 First Nations Canadians. After a decade of high unemployment, suddenly there was work for everyone. National defense plants sprouted across Canada, offering good wages, and people flocked to them. The whole population seemed to be on the move. Within a couple of years, 800,000 people, or 1/6 of the national population, many of them women, were employed in munitions manufacturing. And many of these plants were located in new communities, some which seemed to spring up overnight. Providing spiritual care and shepherding in these new towns where many of the old associations had broken down was a challenge to all of the churches. Meanwhile, those back home were trying to carry on with depleted resources, which sometimes included the minister. For instance, during the war years, Manitoba lost 60,000 people. Other parts of the country were virtually emptied of people and unable to continue ministry. In several areas of over 400 square miles, congregations shared one minister or a summer student. The same thing applied in Saskatchewan, and in northern Ontario, where the Depression land settlement process had not worked at all well, the exodus left a chain of ghost towns behind. However, here and there were people who could not be abandoned. The Reverend A.K. Charlton looked after 10 preaching points in 1943, and when the roads became impassable in winter, he skied for 25 miles a Sunday to bring his services. Financially, the country was booming, but prosperity also brought its challenges. In the cities, as mothers went to work, latchkey children led to an increase in juvenile delinquency. In 1944, the Board of Evangelism and Social Services reported that 167 pregnant girls had applied to the Victor Mission in Toronto, which could take only half of them. The average age of pregnant girls admitted to our 5 United Church homes in 1945 was 15 years. Many families, unused to the newfound wealth, developed alcohol problems, and clergy were kept busy with counseling and interventions. In this period, responding to different and more complex needs, we find a variety of counseling services being sponsored by the church and its missions. Many clergy reported horrific stories of alcohol and spousal and family abuse. Now, the church did profit somewhat from the growing affluence. Givings to the Missionary and Maintenance Fund, which preceded today's Mission and Service Fund, grew steadily. Over $50,000 was given to bombed out British churches, and the whole Depression era deficit of $1.7 million was wiped out. And in 1940, the General Council, with the encouragement of the federal government, encouraged people to buy war bonds and certificate as, quote, a loan to your country and a gift to your church. Committees sprang up across the country, and there was an enthusiastic response. Once again, we see the truly national character of the United Church being revealed. Within it, in 1941, there were 8 Japanese Canadian congregations, and the largest was Powell Street in Vancouver, which had just celebrated its 45th anniversary. And in Mission City, a new Japanese Christian church had been planted and was ready to be dedicated. Then came the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese were now the enemy. There were tragic repercussions, as we saw in a previous week, for Japanese-descended citizens in the country, 76% of which had been born here in Canada. They numbered just over 24,000, of whom 22,000 lived on the BC coast. Suddenly, they were all seen as a security threat, and this precipitated one of the uglier chapters in Canada's history. Though they had an excellent reputation as hard-working, law-abiding, and industrious citizens, the paranoia of war overcame any previous status. The war gave legitimacy to an undercurrent of racism and envy for their economic success. Coastal residents were genuinely terrified by the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and stories about the possibility of Japanese invasion seemed quite credible. It rendered race prejudice and hysteria socially acceptable. Japanese people were dangerous. Their fishing boats were filled with spying equipment. They might poison the water supply. So went the popular cry. Thus, the federal government evacuated them to internment camps in the BC interior. The fact that the majority were Canadian citizens was simply ignored. Over 2,100 went to road building camps in BC and Ontario. 3,600 were given work in the sugar beet fields in Manitoba and Alberta, and a further 3,000 were scattered to various places across the eastern part of the country. The majority, however, were relocated to 15 former mining communities in the BC interior. Their fishing boats, homes, and businesses were impounded. During this period, United Church clergy began to move amongst the internees, reassuring them, ministering to their needs. Some of these pastors were of Japanese descent, some were from the dominant culture, and they worked to maintain connections with the men in the camps. They tried to maintain connections with families that had been separated, and they arranged for families to settle together, and they otherwise strengthened morale. Overseas missionaries from the United, Anglican, and Roman churches often went with the internees, organizing services, schools, and dispensaries. United Church deaconesses took over high schools when the government refused to provide them. This meant that Japanese teenagers following the war had not totally lost their place in the education system. Most of the high schools were directed by former missionaries who had been expelled from Japan, and there were excellent results. For instance, the first Japanese Canadian student to be admitted to University of British Columbia was a graduate of an internee camp school. The presence amongst these internees of United Church staff, missionaries, and volunteers, established a connection for the United Church of Canada with Japanese Canadians that is honored to this day. There was a long-standing Methodist home for single Japanese girls in Vancouver, and after Union, it became a United Church responsibility. As part of the evacuation, 16 of the girls living there, all who were legal wards of the Women's Missionary Society, had to be moved out. The church relocated them to Saskatchewan. Midway through the war, 700 Canadian-born Japanese found work in Toronto, and they were the founding core of Japanese United Churches in that city. The Interchurch Society was very active in supporting these folks, finding them lodging in the face of extreme prejudice. The Women's Missionary Society turned over its training center as a residence for these displaced persons. The Interchurch Council played a crucial role in raising the consciousness of United Church members. They even attempted to access the Prime Minister with their concerns about the treatment of Japanese Canadians. Quote, "The Japanese people never had a fair compensation for their property. They were sold for next to nothing. All were financial losers," end of quotation. The committee did, however, manage to stop a drive towards the mass deportation of Japanese Canadians. In 1945, there was an agitation to ship back all those of Japanese descent, regardless of their place of birth, ship them back to Japan. And RCMP officers were used to urge the Japanese to sign a consent form. No one wanted to go, but a number of the older generation did sign. After frantic work, the Interchurch Committee managed to get a delay of 2 days before the first boat actually sailed. The actual repeal of the regulation took 13 long and anxious months. And during that time, some 4,000 Japanese-born actually left, and they were accompanied by their Canadian-born children. It took 2 further years for those who remained to have their full rights and freedoms restored. There was a somewhat similar, if less extreme, story for 300 German schoolboys who were in England when the war broke out, and they were shipped to Canada and interned. The churches in Canada, particularly in Toronto, took action on their behalf, and in 1941, the Committee on Refugees appealed with success for help, and Victoria University, which was a Methodist and later United Church foundation, fought and won a battle with the University of Toronto to have some of the children admitted as students. And this was after the University of Toronto had decreed that these 300 should be banned. During the war years, the theological colleges tried to increase the supply of ministers by accelerating their program. Students were allowed to continue studies during summer field placements. In 1943, a short course for women was introduced at the United Church Training School for Deaconesses. Educating children was a work that continued to accelerate, as did hospital work on the BC and Labrador coasts, often the only medical assistance to far-flung communities. Statistics for the war year paint an interesting picture. Membership in the church climbed from just under 700,000 to just over 750,000. Sunday school slipped from 550,000 members to under 475,000. Midweek groups also declined, probably due to lack of leadership. Overseas, there was an impact on mission work. India, which had not yet achieved self-rule, declared war on Germany on the same day as Great Britain. The shock waves spread through the country to the Central India Mission of the United Church of Canada. So, in addition to coping with its regular tasks, it was now coping with new challenges. Excuse me. Significant numbers of the most socially oppressed castes in society converted to Christianity, seeing it as a way to improve their overall lot in life. In 1937, for instance, requests for baptism jumped from 300 to 1,500 in a single year. However, illiteracy was widespread in that group. One Canadian-trained Indian pastor was responsible for an area where only 20 could read out of a population of 4,000. The Reverend George Bryce was loaned from United Theological College to spearhead the literacy program. Attached to each of the literacy training camps were medical dispensaries. By 1941, with the impact of the war, the only doctors in all of central India were 4 women, with an absolutely enormous numbers of patients. Mission programs were disrupted when the missions were also asked to train welders, mechanics, and clerks for the army, and when mission-owned printing resources were conscripted to war needs. During repeated cholera epidemics in various parts of India, Canadian missionary doctors, both male and female, worked with few helpers and resources to battle the tide of disease. Mission and Maintenance Fund gifts provided for the vaccination of over 20,000 people. Travel between Canada and India became increasingly dangerous and finally ceased entirely, meaning that both furloughs and replacement staff were curtailed. Missionaries who had sent their children to Canada for education did not see them for a number of years. The attack on Pearl Harbor made it impossible for Westerners to stay in Japan and Korea, both of which were major mission sites for the United Church and for the WMS. The mission staff, while aware of the tensions, had hopes that Christianity might be a major reconciling force, but they were compelled to leave. By 1943, all Canadian-born mission staff had left, but only after 3 of them had been interned by the Japanese for a year. And when the Japanese joined as the third of the Axis power with Germany and Italy in 1940, Japanese Christians and their Canadian friends saw the disruption that was coming. And so the United Church Mission managed to transfer the ownership of kindergartens, social works, and church properties to Japanese control in order that the work might continue. Even more significantly, 33 Christian denominations from different countries working in Japan, plus the Salvation Army, united to form the Church of Christ in Japan, which then took its place as a reorganized Christian council. This created an all-inclusive Christian front, which was unprecedented in the world at that time. Meanwhile, in Korea, save for a single staff person in Seoul, missionary work had flourished in the Northeast and in Manchuria up to 1938. The war in China had repercussions, and mission work was entirely halted in the face of severe and constantly growing oppression. In different parts of China, there were 3 inland missions, and for United Church personnel in China, war itself was not a new thing. There had been civil war and banditry in the country for a number of years. The Japanese had also been taking larger and larger bites out of China since 1931. From 1938 onward, the Japanese continued to expand more and more rapidly, and with their expansion, missionary work came to a halt. Often those missions had been dealing with refugees who had been fleeing from the invaders, and only those missionary staff who could claim Chinese descent, both clergy and doctors, were allowed to remain in occupied areas. In some places, life was actually a little better. A church membership badge was even respected by the bandits as a sign of neutrality, so the missions could continue their work, as could the International Red Cross. But gradually that work was curtailed. With highways blocked, medical supplies were increasingly difficult to get, and the Japanese would put a price on the heads of foreign missionary personnel, medical and otherwise. Inflation was a huge problem. For example, rice in 1938 cost 40 cents a bushel. In 1943 cost $40 a bushel. Everyone was cold because the cost of coal had risen so high it could be used only for cooking. By 1945, the cost of living had risen 300%. And that meant closing some mission schools, and many native-born personnel had to resign because their stipends from the missions were simply too small to support them and their families. In a curious anomaly, the university population managed to thrive in the face of all of this. The Western China Union University had 891 students, plus 3 combined medical schools with over 500 case students. And in each case, half the students were women. By the time the war came to an end, the enrollments had actually increased, so there were some bright notes for the future in the gloom. Concern for refugees absorbed a tremendous amount of time and energy, which usually came from evangelism and church growth efforts. During the war, the Christian community in China actually shrank. When refugees began to return home, they left considerable gaps in the social fabric of the places where they had lived during the war years. The report of 1945 in the United Church Yearbook goes as follows. With personnel just 1/3 of what we had, our line was so thin we could not advance anywhere. In 6 out of 10 stations, we had no foreign pastor and no foreign doctor. In order to keep essential services going, we sold some of our property, and this caused friction with the indigenous church. All in all, there were more than buildings that need repair in the years ahead. In Africa, the United Church had missions in Angola, which was not directly touched by the war, but the international tensions affected it by lowering the resources available for mission work. The war at sea made travel for furlough very difficult, and the native staff, well trained by their Western friends, managed to keep many of the medical clinics, orphanages, and leprosy hospitals open. That's an overview of the impact that the war had on the United Church internally, within the nations, and overseas. Like Canada itself, the church was not left untouched by the war. And like the nation, there were both upsides as well as many downsides to the years of conflict. Since the end of World War II, the United Church has increased its official anti-war staff, playing a role in various anti-nuclear arms and landmines struggles. In most cases, official church policy has been to oppose military intervention, but to support Canada's peacekeeping role. It has also strongly opposed and tried to draw attention to the fact that Canada makes considerable profit as a major arms manufacturer and exporter. At the same time, as a major denomination, the United Church has been a significant provider of chaplains to the armed forces. I look forward to our conversation in class. Thanks very much.